The HMAS Buna incident of 1974 involved obviously the Buna, which was a landing craft, HMAS Parramatta, the ship I was serving on, and personally I was a little involved. But the story had a personal event, is in the night it happened, I was about to go to a 21st birthday party for my soon-to-be bride, and unfortunately she'd put the party off, while I was away in Southeast Asia. When I got back, she'd booked it, and this was the night in July that we were going to celebrate her 21st. Unfortunately, she got to celebrate that on her own. And this is a bit of the story about how that came about. HMAS Buna was part of the Balikpapan class of LCHs, Landing Craft Heavy, that the RAN were operating. Originally built for the Army, they were transferred to the Royal Australian Navy in the early 1970s. In 1974, Buna was providing a lift service to the Army, taking graders and other earth-moving equipment to Lord Howe Island to build an airstrip. The airstrip was to replace the then flying boats that used to fly from Rose Bay out to Lord Howe Island and back. There was going to be serviced by land-based aircraft. HMAS Parramatta was a Type 12 frigate. She was armed with a 4.5-inch gun forward, ICARA mortars for anti-submarine work, ICARA missile system, I should say, and a CCAP missile system for anti-aircraft. She could also fit 50 cal machine guns along her deck, and she carried a large surface radar, which you can see at the top, capable of radar tracking aircraft and ships. She was a very capable ship, powered by two Babcock and Wilcock boilers and two English electric steam turbines. She was built at Cockatoo Dockyard, and she was capable of about 30 knots. On the 19th of July 1974, we were alongside of Garden Island. We'd just been at sea for the week, and we were shutting down. I was involved in doing a minor job in the stern tube, and I noticed the shaft start to speed up, which is very unusual. Normally, in the shutdown process, it would be slowly turning under an electric motor. Divers and shipwrights joined the ship, and as I went down to the engine room to find out what was happening, I was told we were sailing. I had just enough time to get up, make a phone call to my then fiancée, Liz, to tell her that I wouldn't be at her 21st birthday that night, which was a real shame because she'd put it off for 6 months while I was deployed, and we were going to have a great night that night celebrating her 21st. Well, she got to celebrate that on her own, because at 3:30 that afternoon, we sailed for Garden Island. We headed down the harbour at maximum speed at about 18 knots. And then as we passed the Pigs and Sows, we sped up to 29 knots and overtook the Manly Ferry. We were on a mission to get to the HMAS Buna, for we'd been told she'd lost the front door, and she was we'd also lost communication with her. She was about halfway between Sydney and Lord Howe Island, and the front door of the landing craft was down. We didn't know whether it was lost at that stage, and her well deck was open to the sea. We had no idea whether she was a surface afloat or not. As can be seen in this photo, without the front door, that is a very wide opening to the sea, and obviously her whole 3/4 of her length is open to the sea. While she could still float, because she was designed to carry heavy weight, that certainly was a frightening situation for a ship that size to be in. She was in heavy seas, as I said, about halfway between Sydney and Lord Howe Island, and the door had fallen down. Communication was sketchy, and until a tracker found her at about 10 o'clock at night, we were certainly uncertain of her fate. At that time, from about 4 o'clock onwards, we were steaming at close to full speed, heading towards her, hoping to find her afloat. When Fleet received her signal that she had lost her front door and was in some trouble, they scrambled a tracker out of then HMAS Buna. This aircraft was normally carried on the carrier. She had a crew of 4 and was anti-submarine and surface search. She was capable of flying at about 230 knots, thereabouts, and she could cruise at 130 knots and loiter for quite some time. She was on her way out to Lord Howe Island, or on the way from Howe to Lord Howe Island as we sailed, and at the time we sailed, she had not yet reached her. She found her about 10 o'clock that night, and then was able to inform us that Buna was still afloat, and while she had lost the front door completely, by that stage it had ripped off completely, the ship was still floating and steaming astern. As this extract from the report of proceedings says, Parramatta cast off at 15:30, and we headed down the harbour and sped up to 29 knots. We were joined by a tracker aircraft, which had located Nowra and stood vigil until Parramatta could close. The weather deteriorated rapidly, and its contact area was closed. At 1:30, we sighted the Buna, and the waves were 25 foot high, and the wind was gusting to 48 knots. It was not a pleasant night. After the situation was assessed, the towing gear was laid out, and attempts were made to pass the lines. It should be remembered that an LCH is very much a small ship, and the area that we needed to get that towing gear across was her stern, which was probably about 8 feet, maybe 10 feet in length. Not a lot of room to get a piece of wire across and the ropes handled on, but we had to tow her astern because we could not tow her forward. It took us some time. We eventually did get to tow her about 2 knots, but when we attempted to change the tow, it became fouled around our port propeller shaft. While that sounds silly, it is unfortunately, so it's one of the risks when passing towing gear, and particularly when you've got such a small ship to pass it to and such heavy weather. We waited overnight, and for that night, the Buna towed us, keeping the weather off her, but keeping the weather on us, and we were rolling like a proverbial pig. We arrived in the dawn the next morning. We managed to pass the tow and started the long, slow tow astern to Sydney. This image shows the Buna after she was reached Sydney Harbour, heading off in by herself and Parramatta astern. And the other image shows that big splash at the back of the ship was in fact the Buna being towed backwards by Parramatta. It was a very uncomfortable ride for those guys. What I should say is when the divers freed the propeller shaft, the brave fellow from Clearance Diving Team 1 dived under the ship, swam up underneath it, and had to time the roll of the ship to when he would swim up and grab hold of the propeller shaft. The ship was rolling about 30 odd degrees either way at the time, and the propeller shaft was wrapped in the rope, which, being a nylon base rope, had actually melted to the shaft. It took them about an hour to hacksaw and hack through the rope or the burnt plastic that was jammed on our shaft until such times as he had managed to remove it, clear the shaft, and we were able to get underway. So it was quite a brave action by that young lad, who unfortunately I don't remember his name. However, he did get mentioned in dispatches, so I should be able to look it up. This picture shows HMAS Buna and HMAS Parramatta together in the harbour. HMAS Buna is on her way to Waterhen, where she would have berthed, and started to carry out repairs. Ultimately, she would be dry docked in, I think, Cockatoo to have the bow door replaced. And we were on our way in Parramatta to HMAS, either alongside HMAS Store, or we may have gone back to Garden Island Dockyard and berthed on one of the wharfs there. Either way, we were on our way home to settle down for the night. And one of the offshoots of this is our captain at the time wrote to Fleet Headquarters suggesting that in future, any landing craft going to Lord Howe Island should be escorted. They totally agreed with that. And guess which ship made the first escort journey? Yep, HMAS Parramatta. But at least that one was a little quicker because the landing craft could proceed at about 8 knots on her own power. One of the reasons we towed her back was that while she could have gone astern at 2 to 3 knots and made her own way back, although that would have been difficult, steaming astern in those sea waves, she could have done that. However, she just didn't have the fuel, because while she had the fuel to do it in the headwind ahead, going astern used a lot more power for less distance. So that was the reason we towed her astern so she could get there. We could have tried to refuel her, but that probably would have been even more difficult than trying to tow her. Anyway, that was the story. It was a simple story. HMAS Parramatta went back to sea after this adventure and started her workup, or continued her workups, and ultimately deployed that year. I think it was to Southeast Asia again. But and she went about her normal duties. Buna had her door replaced and eventually was transferred to the New Guinean Navy. And but it was a simple story. But one of the things that those of us who served at sea know, best laid plans of mice and men, it can be changed very rapidly. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that story.